Welcome to the Ancestral Cure Podcast. I'm your host, Julian, and I'm here to guide you through the fascinating realm of holistic health. Join us as we bridge ancient wisdom with modern science to help you achieve optimal health, reclaim your vitality, and unlock your body's true potential. Welcome back, everyone, to episode 5 of the Ancestral Cure Podcast. Today, I've got a very special guest. He is a health consultant, a functional bloodwork analyst, and he also looks at symptoms and how they relate to chronic issues. Chris, how are you doing?
I'm doing really good. How about yourself?
I'm not bad, yeah. It's great to have you on. So,
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
yeah, so I'd love for you to give our audience a bit of an introduction to you. Um, what's your story, what's your background, and how did you get into health and helping people with their chronic issues and symptoms and blood work and all that?
Yeah, yeah. I can give a little bit of the cliff notes on that. So it all started for me actually when I was like 18 months old. And I had a little bit of a reaction, let's just say, to the experimental injections that they love to give to infants. So before that, very healthy baby, could do whatever. And after that, I developed severe asthma, severe eczema. I would break out into hives for practically no reason. I developed 40 plus life-threatening food allergies and was limited to probably like 5 to 10 foods as a child. And I started getting things like C. diff, all these random infections. I was probably on over 50 courses of antibiotics as a child. So I was basically a guinea pig for the medical system in my childhood. And I remember very vividly as a kid, I would go from like doctor to doctor to doctor thinking, okay, maybe I'll get the help I need now. And it was just always the same answer. It was, we don't know, actually. And basically, I lived a lot of my childhood like that. I couldn't have turkey for Thanksgiving, which is obviously an American holiday, until I was around like 12, 13 years old. And I had all these issues. And thankfully, my mom was actually into a little bit of the holistic health stuff herself. So she gave me very basic interventions like Manuka honey, um, just eating cleaner food, getting more sunlight for vitamin D, Saccharomyces boulardii. So those things did move the needle a little bit for me in my childhood, and it was very surprising to see that, obviously. But basically, from a young age, I was very compelled to go to medical school and become a physician because I thought to myself, maybe if I'm sick and I'm having all these issues, maybe when I'm all grown up, I can help the same people through those sorts of issues and be the person that I always wished I had when I was a child. So that was my plan since I was around like 8 years old, I would say. It was a very young age where I wanted to do that. And basically, I went through elementary school, middle school, high school with the intention of doing that. Went to my actual undergraduate at Arizona State. I studied biomedical sciences, and I obviously took that very fun exam called the MCAT. And I did all these extracurriculars, all this good stuff to go to med school. Did well on the MCAT, could have went to med school, but in between that and during that journey, I got very sick when I was in college. And it was probably a combination of, doing college kid things, not being the healthiest, all on top of my existing predispositions. And I basically developed this thing where I would just puke up stomach acid every time I would eat something. And as I was waiting to take my MCAT and I was in the process of studying for it, which for some people that might take 3 to 5 months, I was just basically bedridden, puking up stomach acid. My friends had to like help me walk up the stairs. I was basically just non-functional in every way. And I had to figure something out because I was so just motivated to obviously do this. I'd shadowed for 300 hours, was all in on this. So nobody could help me. I went from GI doctor to GI doctor, went from basically specialist to specialist over the course of months. And basically after that, this was down the road, but I went to naturopaths and all this other stuff, and I could not find the help that I needed. So as I'm studying for this MCAT, I do one little switch, and I wasn't even that sure out of it. Like I was just looking in the literature. I was introduced to Twitter by a friend, and I started to find some of the good holistic health community there. And I'm like, okay, it won't hurt. Let me just walk to the library every morning while the sun is rising, and let's see if that makes a difference. And let's see if it also makes a difference to remove all of the crappy food from my diet. So I did those two things, and believe it or not, I got myself healthy enough to where I could study for the MCAT and get a very good score on it. So I was able to resolve the issue, but nevertheless, if I still ate like FODMAPs or any sort of food, outside of like the very basic things that I restricted myself to, I would get like severe bloating. I would get a reaction. I would just start sweating out of nowhere and have thermoregulation issues. And a lot of these same things still started to resurface on the side. Like I remember one time I had pineapple and I puked so much from it that I was out for like 3 days in agonizing pain. Like I literally couldn't do anything for 3 days straight. And I was like, okay, is this like bad pineapple? So I gave it to my roommate and he tried it and nothing happened to him. So I was like, there's clearly something wrong with me and I have to figure this out even after the MCAT. So basically what I did was I started dropping all my money on naturopaths, and unfortunately, that didn't work either. So not only was I sick, but I was broke too after that, and I had to figure something out. So basically, I'm working as a personal trainer at this time at this awesome gym, and I have a client. He's like 55 years old, and he is leg pressing 700 pounds. So I'm like, dude, how are you doing this? Tell me right now. Are you on steroids? What's going on here? And he says, no, actually, I met this chiropractor 3 years ago. And believe it or not, I was in a wheelchair 3 years ago from a injury from an experimental injection, let's just say. So he's in this like path. He's leg pressing 700 pounds. And what's going through my head is, what did you do to go from that, being in a wheelchair, super sick, to literally leg pressing 700 pounds and looking like you're 40 when you're 55? Like, what could you have possibly done? So he just goes into it and he tells me a lot of the interventions he did. He tells me that he meets this guy. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go to this guy too. So this guy puts me on to a lot of the deeper and more nuanced stuff in the circadian space. So getting UVA, getting sunrise and sunset, getting NIR, being outside grounded to the earth. I start to figure out more of that. Then he goes into the importance of beneficial bacteria, obviously eating a whole foods diet where you prepare your foods while obviously getting rid of the anti-nutrients. And he just taught me a lot of these basic foundations that we talk about, even things like improving sleep, things like improving the gym, things like optimizing the actual nervous system to be a balanced seesaw between sympathetic and parasympathetic. He taught me a lot of that really good stuff. And I got myself to kind of like to that next level of health where instead of being stuck at like 5 foods pretty much, I could go to like 15 to 20 foods. And I started to get myself up there and a little bit better. So that happened, and then I obviously kept going. I kept going. I just noticed that I hit a wall. And then basically, I met my next mentor after this through social media, and we just had a few conversations about what it means to heal holistically. What is the difference between somebody who's chronically sick versus somebody who's chronically unwell? What is the difference between obviously healing holistically and following something more so with salutogenesis rather than pathogenesis? And I learned about how to obviously read blood chemistry, how to assess symptomology, how to use all of the knowledge I'd learned from physiology to get into this stuff. And honestly, by the time I learned a lot of this stuff, I was in a position where I was able to cure my asthma, cure my eczema, no more hives when I break outside, fix most of my food sensitivities, heal from over 35 allergies. And I basically got rid of like all of this stuff going through that process. And when I was doing it, I was just on social media for fun at that point. My old Twitter account name was actually the Mito Bro. And unfortunately, I was shadow banned. But basically, I restarted my accounts after that. And I just decided from there. I had my master's in medical nutrition at that point, and med school was still something that was on my mind. And I said, honestly, I think that there's a very big need for people in the more holistic space to help people in what they do outside of the doctor's office because you could smoke all the cigarettes in the world and drink 2 liters of Coke every single day if you want to, but you can't blame your doctor for those lifestyle choices. And in addition to that, your doctor isn't trained to look at salutogenesis. The medical industry is trained to look at pathogenesis, which is treating and diagnosing disease. So it's very different from obviously the other side of the coin where you're looking for what brings forth the origins of health in a dysfunctional system. And that might look like resolving gut dysbiosis, resolving mitochondrial dysfunction. Because if you have healthy mitochondria, right, that promotes health in the system. So when I shifted my mentality more to that and just realized that there's two sides to the coin, not only did it give me more respects for certain medical professionals that still do a really good job, but also for just healing holistically and what we can do in that. And ever since that, basically, I've been quite obsessed with looking into this stuff and educating myself and growing every day. I've worked with over 100 clients, and yeah, it's been genuinely awesome. But obviously, there's a lot more to the story, but I would say that's like the cliff notes of how we got here today.
That's really inspiring. I think, yeah, it's really tough when you're part of a system and nothing's working, whether it's the doctors or the medications that they're giving, and you're just unable to heal from these symptoms. So, when it comes to the differences between conventional system and holistic system, is that just down to what you talked about, like pathogenesis versus pseudogenesis? Like, what's the difference between that? And
Yeah,
do you think there's
yeah,
more
because
differences?
yeah, so you go to the doctor, right? And they say your LDL is high. Let me give you a statin. I would ask a very different question. I would say, how's your insulin? What's your family history of cardiovascular, which they would obviously ask too, but I would be looking at other things too, like insulin, HbA1c. Are you digesting fats properly? Did you decide to go carnivore and totally tank your thyroid and then as a result raise your LDL? Like I would do a much more thorough investigation rather than saying like, hey, your LDL is high, let's give you a statin. So that's the big thing that I think about when I'm looking at that stuff. When I look at blood chemistry, any of that information, I want to ask myself, what does this mean? Like what, like I get that this is dysfunctional, but where is that dysfunction actually coming from? And that's why looking at other markers and looking at labs basically a more functional perspective can really help if you're looking at it through the lens of salutogenesis, because you're asking yourself, which of these systems are bringing forth dysfunction in the body? And how can I look at these systems and say, here's what's upstream of what, here's what's downstream of what, and here's the precise interventions that we need to utilize to bring homeostasis into the actual system. Does that kind of make sense?
Right, yeah. So it's about asking, like, why are you dysregulated in the first place rather than
Yeah,
here's a
yeah,
pill, here's a medication
yeah.
just to fix it.
Yeah, and you're looking for like ideally, if I want to put it into one sentence more concisely, with salutogenesis, you're looking for what brings forth the origins of health. Like that's what it's all about. Healthy mitochondria, they bring forth the origins of health. A very healthy gut, that promotes a lot of health, doesn't it? Very healthy immune system, that promotes health and homeostasis. So we're looking at the overall story of this person, right? And we're looking at symptomology, which is qualitative data. We're looking at quantitative data through labs, and then we're analyzing the patterns between that, and we're painting a picture of actually what the underlying story of this person's physiology is. But pathogenesis, right? It's still very important. Like if somebody comes to me with a very bad skin issue and it's like all over their face, it's actually not my role to diagnose that. It's my role to say, hey, go see a dermatologist, get this checked out, tell me what it is, tell me what their diagnosis is. They've had years of formal training in this area. And if they want to give you, I don't know, like ketoconazole shampoo for your dandruff, and you don't want to do that, maybe you come back to me and say, "Hey, what can we do about this?" And I'll look at your actual blood chemistry. I'll look at your symptomology and I'll say, "Here are the weakened areas of your physiology." And rather than saying this is exactly what it means and this is exactly what's happening to you, I say the evidence here suggests that this could be a very strong possibility, and here's everything I have to back that up. And then I'll go over some physiological reasoning, and we'll look at all of the little levers we can pull to help with whatever it may be that's contributing to that seborrheic dermatitis, which could look at things like maybe an internal fungal overgrowth, maybe your innate immune system is weakened, maybe you have low lactobacillus in the gut, and we're going to look at every little area that could be contributing to that. And we're simply going to optimize the area and bring forth homeostasis to the systems to kind of just eradicate that chance of that genetic predisposition from coming to light anymore. And we're going to build a really strong, resilient, robust foundation. But nevertheless, right? Like if I break my arm, if I get sepsis, if I need a proper diagnosis for something, the medical system most certainly has its role. And we still need great physicians to obviously enter that system and hopefully obviously have a little bit more respect for the more holistic ideologies so that we can work together because the ultimate goal is to get these people healthy, not to be right.
Exactly. I think when it comes to the conventional health system, it just has to, you just have to look at the cost and the benefits and decide, is it, do the positives outweigh the negatives? And if we're talking about like, getting stabbed or getting hit by a car, sepsis, breaking a bone, I think the positives
Take me to
of,
the doctor.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I think if we're looking at things that are more chronic, um, it's obviously a lot more difficult to heal if you're in a hospital environment where you've got artificial blue light, they're waking you up
Totally.
after every 2 hours, you've got bad food, like just completely devoid of nutrients.
Yeah, they're giving
And
you junk. Then they're
exactly.
giving you junk light, and they're giving you junk air quality, and there's germs everywhere. It's a
And
big
then
problem.
instead of actually looking at your symptoms and how to heal and how to address, the root causes, it might not just be one root cause, but like addressing what's actually going on, they would much rather just give you a pill or say, well, let's just suppress the symptoms rather than, yeah, address the root cause. So I think that's what people have to be careful of when they look at like conventional health versus holistic health.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And I like what you said about root cause, but yeah, the way that I think about root causes is it's often not one root cause. It's often multiple systems that are working with each other, and there's simply just dysfunction between the systems. So maybe like for example, maybe somebody could have leaky gut, a fungal overgrowth, and like a regular glucose homeostasis all in one. So rather than saying like the root causes are this, I would kind of rephrase it and say, here are your weakened areas of physiology, and here's how they actually interact with one another. For example, did you know that if you're trying to get rid of a fungal overgrowth, like Candida, for example, it can utilize your blood sugar spikes if it's very dysregulated to resist the antifungal treatment. So when I get a client with fungal issues, I have to be very serious about things like their weight, the amount of visceral fat they have, their overall blood sugar, and a lot of the time I'm putting them on a protocol to get their insulin back between 2 and 6 so that we can successfully do this antifungal phase. So there's so much that goes into it, and when you think about it from a more like systems physiology approach, you can be a lot more nuanced and multivariable in terms of the way your interventions work, how you structure them, and even the order in which you have them.
Exactly. So when you work with clients and look at their symptoms and blood work, let's say somebody were to ask, well, yeah, why would they not just go to a doctor? What's the difference? And we've already talked about like symptoms, root causes, but in terms of like looking specifically at blood work, yeah, what's the difference in how conventional doctors interpret blood work versus how more holistic practitioners interpret blood work?
I was hoping you would ask me this one. All right, so here's what you got to know. You could go to the doctor and you could look at your insulin, for example, and the reference range would be between 2 and 25. Now, how did they get that range? That little reference range that you see where they always have the same phrase, it's normal. How do we get that? How do we get that range? Well, it's based on population averages of people who get their labs done. Well, if you look at the United States, for example, 75% of us have one or more chronic illness. So if we're crunching numbers, right, it is just confounding variable after confounding variable in there because you're taking the data of a bunch of a fairly sick population, and then you're deeming that as the standard for what this reference range should be. Whereas when I look at labs, I'm going into the literature and I'm checking what is the optimal range for this based on a healthy population subset. So insulin, for example, it would be between 2 and 6 rather than 2 and 25 if you only took healthy people. So you could be at fasting insulin 18, and they probably wouldn't have much to say to you until your insulin HbA1c were at a glucose, and your glucose as well, we're at a level where they could say, hey, this is a disease now. This is diabetes, so we have to treat you with this medication. But what leads to diabetes? Insulin resistance. So I'm checking for that in advance because insulin resistance alone is going to cause terrible issues to your physiology. I mean, for crying out loud, it can even contribute to things like androgen dysregulation, PCOS. It can obviously mess with your it can create like this nasty feedback loop with your metabolic health. It can be bad for wound healing and all these other things in your system. So with insulin resistance, like if I see that at 18, my eyes are going to light up and I'm going to say, let me help you right away, rather than saying your labs came back normal. So basically, it's based on these population subsets, and we want to look at what's optimal based on a healthy human rather than looking at what's normal, because there's nothing normal about feeling terrible, I like to say. And in addition to that, if you actually look at the reference range for LDL cholesterol, we actually have, because I know they love their population data when they talk about cholesterol. Well, I have some population data to spit right back at them. Did you know that the reference or like the actual range for those who live a very long time, like up to 90, 100 years old with cholesterol, is between, I think it was 100, between 170, I want to say. So doctors will start to lose their mind when they see it get above like 150. But if you look into the literature, you'll find that the real range for that is between like 80 and 170. And it's a big issue that this is like the reality, right? Because in 2004, they had something called the National Cholesterol Education Panel in the United States, and 8 out of the 9 physicians on that panel had a direct tie to statin manufacturers, presenting a clear conflict of interest. So, since that decision was made, the actual threshold for statins to be prescribed in terms of your actual labs and blood chemistry has been lowered, and statin prescriptions have gone up by over 300% since then. There's even literature that I've read out there where they're going over in the paper talking about incentives that they can give to patients to take the statins and incentives for physicians. So there's literal research out there talking about these ideas and these things out there. And in my opinion, we're just going backwards. We're going in the wrong direction, especially considering that we're not even asking the question of what does this elevated LDL cholesterol mean even? So that's just like my little kind of like rant on all of that.
Yeah, I actually heard of that statin conflict of interest. It was like 2004 and they lowered their cholesterol threshold because, like you said, the people on the panel had ties to statin manufacturers. Um, but it's funny that you mentioned LDL and insulin because I think in the conventional medical space, like a lot of doctors and medical students, they sort of think of these like isolated concepts, whether it's cholesterol, insulin, and it's just they're not looking at the bigger picture. They just see that it's high and they'll prescribe you a statin or tell you to eat less red meat. Because this was like a year and a half ago, but I was speaking to someone I know that's a medical student, and I said because obviously she had never heard of the whole like all she knew was that like high cholesterol is bad, causes heart attacks, get on a statin, and I said, well, actually, there's a lot of interesting literature about how it's actually insulin resistance that is one of the biggest factors that causes less nitric oxide in the blood vessels
Huge.
to
Yeah.
repel LDL cholesterol. So what I said
Yes.
was like LDL is only bad for you if you're insulin resistant, and obviously there are a lot of other factors that I've since learnt. But what she said was, well, cholesterol's got nothing to do with insulin, so it's like they sort of just see things as isolated.
They do. That's why you have a bunch of different specialties in the medical system. That's why you have a cardiovascular one, a neurological one, and that's what I like about healing holistically. You're more of like a jack of all trades when you're looking at how to heal holistically. You have to have an understanding of how these systems interact with one another. And instead of looking at health very statically, you're looking at it very dynamically. And you're seeing how are these parts moving? What are the moving parts? And how is this all operating together? What's upstream? What's downstream? And this is the big difference, I would argue, between these two systems. And they both serve their own role, right? So my big thing is when I see these doctors on social media just bashing holistic health, can you like put your ego aside, please, for the rest of us who have actually made progress in healing with methods outside of what you were taught in your medical lecture? Because it's a big deal. It's no disrespect or anything, but it's very important that both of these sides respect each other. Because as I said earlier, it's not about being right. It's about actually helping people. Like there are genuinely people out there who are suffering on a day-to-day basis. And some of these people are so obsessive about being right that they lose sight of the reason that they went to medical school in the first place. So it's just a big thing. And I'm not saying that this is every doctor, but I'm saying based on the conversations that I've had with many physicians and providers, I personally, somebody who's went through that system, felt very disrespected. And even for example, like when I was in the fourth grade, I went to this very famous medical institution, and they did nothing but poke fun of my height and weight as like a 9, 10-year-old, basically. And I just remember that, and it's just absolutely awful that it's not in the hearts of everybody who's working in this profession, that it's all about helping people and seeing how can we be stewards to other through the gifts that God has given us.
Exactly. And it's funny you mentioned that, like, they they get like they mock holistic health and they mock people who have actually healed their symptoms from holistic healing and looking at the bigger picture. Like you'd think that they would be happy that people were able to heal.
Yes, I have a funny story from my mentor who will not be named, but basically, the story goes, my mentor helped heal somebody's lupus, and the doctor called him screaming, saying that it was all his interventions that worked, and basically just told him off. And my mentor's like, well, actually, I'm not a doctor. I wasn't giving any medical advice. And he basically just went into it and told him back off. And it's this big thing of like the number one thing that we need to do in this industry is help people heal. And that requires putting a lot of our own egos aside. So I think it's a very important thing to consider. And for anybody who's looking to go to medical school or do holistic health coaching, you have to remember that the number one reason that we do this or that we should be doing this is out of the goodness of our hearts to help other human beings. Like that's what it's all about.
100%. So when you work with clients and you've got their blood panels and their symptoms, how do you connect the symptoms and the blood work, and how do you identify chronic issues and decide, what's going on with this client? How do we help him or her? And yeah, like how do you identify all of those?
Of course, I'll take you through my process for that. So basically and everybody has a little bit of a different way of doing it. I like to say that it's often more of an art than a science, but me, if you know me in person, you know that I'm very type A. So the way that I do it is I'll basically take every single lab through the panel that I give them that's out of range. I'll write it down. I'll write down what the optimal range is based on the literature. And then I'm going to look at very deeply into the symptomology. So I give a questionnaire to my clients that's probably over 100 questions long. And I just get as much intel as I can from that. And then I schedule a call with everyone who I work with. And then basically on that call, I'm going to ask questions like, hey, I saw that you marked your bloating as a 7 out of 10. Does this occur above the belly button or below the belly button? Is it a gassy or a full type of bloating? Because if it's a gassy type of bloating, that can signal over fermentation. And then maybe I look at their bilirubin level and I see that it's elevated. And then I see that they have a bunch of nutrient deficiencies and maybe they have low neutrophils. And then in my head, it's just ticking off like, oh no, this person's sensitive to garlic onion. Maybe they might have SIBO. Maybe the evidence does suggest that. So I do that and I look through every single symptom. And if it's a full type of bloating where food's like sitting in their stomach, that might just mean that they have overall digestive issues. So I do that with every single symptom that they check off that they write as significant. I get as much data about from their health from basically the starting point to where it is now. I ask questions about which protocols or interventions have worked in the past. I ask what their biggest goals are, what their biggest issues are, and I just get as much information as I possibly can to paint a picture of what could be going on. And once I have a good idea of the case, then I can go back to the labs, and that's when the magic can really happen, right? Because then I can think and I can look at that, and I can look at the patterns between the actual labs that are out of range and the actual symptoms that are showing a bunch of funky stuff. And I can kind of be a pattern recognizer and kind of connect those dots and say, here's evidence that this area of your physiology may be weakened. So maybe that looks like a really bad thyroid ratio between free T3 and free T4, paired with cold extremities, issues with constipation, hair loss, maybe some of these other things related to the thyroid. And then for something like leaky gut, maybe I'll look at things like their neutrophils, their globulin. Do they have a ton of food sensitivities? And with this process, a lot of the time it's a process of deduction too. So I'm thinking like, okay, you got your bilirubin back and it's super high, but we need to rule out Gilbert syndrome now. So let's go see if you have, or let's go test your indirects and directs bilirubin to see and rule this out basically. So I go through this very long process of mapping out every little marker, every little symptom that they have, and then kind of analyzing the patterns between everything. And once I can do that, it makes my life super easy because then I can analyze it all and I can safely say, based on the evidence, this analysis really suggests that the following areas or your weakened areas of physiology, here's what's upstream of what, here's what's downstream of what, and here's how all of this kind of works together. And then from there, it makes my life really easy because then I can give you informed interventions instead of throwing 10 trillion supplements at you and then hoping for the best. Then I can give you very specific dietary recommendations to what your exact situation is. Then I can maybe look at obviously your nutrition and analyze that too and help you in those areas as well. So I just find that if you're looking through this stuff, we know that the human body is very complex. We know that we're probably never going to know everything about the human body. So that's why I like the evidence-based approach, because then we can say, using things to back up our claims, here's what all of this information and what this data means, and here's what it suggests in the context of your physiology and your physiological story.
Right, yeah. That's really interesting. So it's about looking at all of the different patterns and connecting them, whether it's, like you said, things that might indicate gut, like gut inflammation, SIBO, even, certain food sensitivities, whether it's like infections, like parasite infections, fungal infections. So if we talk about gut health specifically, what are some similarities in terms of like symptoms and blood markers which indicate poor gut health? And then if we, divide it into like SIBO or sulfur sensitivity, or like what are like infections, gut infections, like what are the differences and how do we distinguish between them?
Yeah, so we'll use a fun example here. So let's talk about the difference between SIBO and just generalized gut dysbiosis in the large bowel. So basically, you want it to be around 95% bacteria in the large bowel, and then only like 5% of that into the small bowel. Now, what can happen is if you have a strong history of constipation, let's just say, basically, that can allow the stool to have additional time to ferment, and then some of that bacteria can make its way up into the actual small intestine. And then you might have a little bit more than you should. So if we look at this from a like basically a functional labs perspective, you'll notice things like they do very bad with FODMAPs. So maybe garlic, onions, sweet potato, artichoke, leeks. Maybe they do absolutely awful with that, coconut water and those types of things. And often it's like a very bad set of symptoms. Like they'll get a lot of like gas and bloating from that sort of stuff. They'll get stomach cramps and all these different pains. Maybe sometimes it's associated with allergies and whatnot. But basically, if we're looking at SIBO in a blood test, you'll see things a lot of the time. And it doesn't mean every time, but you'll see things like MCV is raised because they're low in B9 or B12. And that can also be from things like stomach acid or just low dietary intake. But it can be a clue, right, into something like that because we know that the small intestine is very important for nutrient absorption. And if you have an overgrowth of the bacteria that like to eat folates and B12 in that area, they might be taking it from you. So we can actually get insight into that with a marker like MCV because it's our mean cell volume. And we know that for DNA synthesis in the red blood cell, you need B9 and B12 as cofactors. And if it's getting snatched up due to SIBO, for example, it might be an issue, right? Because you're going to see the MCV raise because the cell is going to compensate by increasing its own cytoplasm production. Therefore, we're going to see the volume increase. But remember, it's a process of deduction. So even right there, through my head, I'm thinking, could it be from low stomach acid instead? Could it be from some sort of other reason that's going on? Like, are they just not eating enough of it? So that's why with the clients, and you're trying to figure this out, right? You want to have them like track their food, for example, or see like, hey, are you taking a B complex? to really map that out. And then you want to look at other markers like your neutrophils, for example, which is a type of white blood cell. And basically, when it goes low, it can kind of signal that you have a bit of a chronic infection going on. So you would want to look at neutrophils. You would want to look at serum folate, serum B12. You would want to look at things like your bilirubin because we know that basically having proper bile flow is important for SIBO prevention. So you want to look at all of those different areas just for assessing for SIBO. And if you have gut dysbiosis, it's a different thing, right? That's basically when you have an imbalance of good and bad bacteria. And this very commonly happens in the large bowel. So you might end up having a case of ideally we should have around 85% good bacteria, 15% like bad bacteria. I guess they like to call it good and bad. It's highly debated though. But basically, you want to have around an 85% to 15 of those types of bacteria. And usually when someone has dysbiosis, it's somewhere in between where it shouldn't be. So maybe you have like 50% good, 50% bad, and the bad guys are just overrunning, or maybe you have a very low amount of good bacteria and you have this issue and it's concentrated in the large bowel. Well, what you're going to see with that is maybe you don't have the high bilirubin in that instance. Maybe MCV looks like a little bit more normal than it should. Maybe they just have like low bifidobacteria and it's manifesting as a bunch of food sensitivities. Maybe they have very low neutrophils as a result of that. And maybe they have things like an impaired mucus layer. Maybe it's contributed to things like leaky gut in the system overall. But nevertheless, right, if you're taking somebody through an antimicrobial phase, you're going to do roughly like a similar set of interventions if it's something like SIBO or gut dysbiosis, but it's still something important to differentiate so that you can actually see what is the underlying story involved here. And that's why it becomes such a personalized nitpicky process where you're going through these sorts of things because you're looking at these major differences between these sort of stuff. So that's a pretty big indication. And then with the dysbiosis, right, if you have low lactobacillus bifidobacteria, it can actually open up the door for things like candida by making it a very bad environment. Maybe you don't have enough lactobacillus to keep that stuff in check. And it can open the door for that type of stuff, obviously in the large bowel, which is very common with fungus to exist there. So then you start looking into those things and you think, okay, we know that candida makes acetaldehyde. And is it possible that this person's liver enzymes are being raised as a result of the acetaldehyde production? And you look into a few of those areas. And of course, you're also assessing symptomology throughout the way and seeing like, are you sensitive to FODMAPs or is it just like these random sets of foods that you don't even understand, like why they would be sensitive to this stuff? Like, do they randomly have a histamine intolerance and have like no issues with FODMAPs, for example? That's something you would want to look at as well. But basically, when you're differentiating in the gut, there's so many different areas where it's almost essential to know the physiology of how that stuff all works.
Yeah, that was really detailed. I mean, obviously, a lot of people suffer from gut issues, and it's just really overwhelming when they don't know specifically, like whether it's SIBO, gut dysbiosis, sulfur sensitivity. But from what you've said, it does seem like it comes down to like an imbalance in bacteria if it's gut dysbiosis. So like you're not you don't have those beneficial strands like bifidobacteria or
Yes.
lactobacillus. So what would cause us to be depleted of those in the first place, and how do we go about treating it? Is it by supplementing probiotics? Is it by, I've heard people say take prebiotics and postbiotics rather than
Beautiful question.
postbiotics. How do we
Yeah.
decide which
So how
solution
does this
works?
happen in the first place? And then how do we fix it? I like
Yeah.
it. So there's many reasons why this happens in the first place, but probably the most common one that I see is childhood antibiotic use. I think that doctors are very keen to overprescribe these days a lot of antibiotics, and it takes, if you look in the literature, it can take 18 months to 2 years to
Mhm.
reestablish your microbiome after taking an antibiotic, given that you're a healthy individual. Let's say that you're not a healthy individual, you might just be chronically stuck with a low level of good bacteria for a while. And it can be a serious issue because the gut is like a garden. Like we don't fix a gut, we improve an environment. And basically, if you want your, like, you need to have good soil to grow good plants, I say. So if you have a dysfunctional terrain, if you have poor stomach acid production, if you have a bad gut mucus layer, if your paneth cell function sucks, if you don't have enough intestinal stem cells, if the actual gut lining is compromised and allowing things to go past it, all of these are going to be contributors that kind of incentivize the body to not make good bacteria as effectively. And you'll see this over and over and over again on a test, basically. But in addition to that, C-section births are a huge problem because you're missing out on all of the lactobacillus and bifidobacteria that you would get from the vaginal canal. And in addition to that, not breastfeeding is an issue because then you're not going to get the actual human milk oligosaccharides that feed the bifidobacteria and allow it to proliferate and colonize the gut in a way that allows it to train the innate immune system as the young infant is developing their immune system. And it's probably what happened to me, honestly. I was a C-section baby, so thankfully I was breastfed, but C-section baby had predispositions to stuff, so it'll happen in life. So that the antibiotics, living indoors all the time and not like being in nature on soil, not eating enough fermented foods, eating a diet low in fiber, all of those things are contributors to a very bad gut. So if we think about fixing it, we have to actually first and foremost see what exactly is wrong with it. Like, is it low beneficial bacteria? Is it too many bad bacteria? Is it a fungal overgrowth? Is it an innate immune system issue that allows certain fungal overgrowths to take place? Is it the fact that they have a bad mucus layer or do their paneth cells suck? We're looking at all of those areas. And basically, once we figure that stuff out, we can actually do an approach that prioritizes the exact set of things that's wrong in a stepwise fashion. But to go into like what you can do to help reestablish the microbiome, obviously what I just mentioned is step one. You want to see what your weakened areas of physiology are. But in terms of like answering that more vaguely, just in general for people to know, it's very important that we get fermented foods in, that we're in soil, getting proper sunlight production, that we have good mitochondrial health. And we also want to eat things that promote butyrate production. So things like potatoes, for example, can help out with that because butyrate is important for actually helping us build a healthy gut mucus layer. Additionally to that, you're going to want to get prebiotic fiber in. So asparagus, soluble fibers, that sort of stuff is important. And then in addition to that, you could do postbiotics. Like, let's say you think that you have a terrible gut mucus layer, you could always do sodium butyrate or tributrin. But in terms of getting that naturally, you would want things like potatoes for natural butyrate production. And then, yeah, basically even things like butter, right, are high in short chain fatty acid content. So it can be amazing for that sort of thing in the body. So we want to look into all those areas, and we got to remember this is not going to change in a month, probably not 2 months, probably not 3 months. Like you have to be committed to making healing the gut a part of your lifestyle. Like you have to be committed to consistently eating fermented foods, to consistently getting 30 grams of fiber a day if you're able to tolerate it. And if you're not, then you have to be committed to obviously fixing the dispositions in your physiology that aren't allowing you to have that in the first place, basically. And when you're committed to doing those sorts of things and you're getting your prebiotics in, you're getting your actual fermented foods in and your postbiotics in, it can be really good. And in terms of probiotics, I do use them for a lot of my clients, but I more so use them because we know that most probiotics are dead and the evidence is pretty mixed on if they recolonize the gut or not. So I simply use them to act in place of what's not already there if they have like low beneficial bacteria or that sort of thing. But in my opinion, I don't, it's hard, it would be very difficult for me to provide an argument into using probiotics to rebuild your microbiome. Like I have not confidence enough in the evidence that I've seen to actually say that. But I would say that they have a place. And if you're somebody who has like low beneficial bacteria, SBO probiotics can be a very good support supplement to consider.
That's really interesting, especially, yeah, when you talked about how like bifidobacteria, like the relationship between, well, human milk oligosaccharides and how they feed bifidobacteria. And that, obviously that can, create butyrate as well. It can feed the bacteria which make butyrates. So
Yes, sir.
what,
Akkermansia
yeah,
waxing.
exactly. So what's the exact difference between prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics?
Okay. Prebiotics. they feed like the actual bacteria that we're trying to grow. And then postbiotics are obviously important for the overall environment as well. So it's like we want to feed the stuff, and then we obviously want to allow things like butyrate production to take place so that it's able to optimize these other strains of bacteria. Because if you look at a GI map, right, all of the strains of bacteria and whatnot, they're all kind of doing very different things, and there's a lot of different moving parts. So we want to utilize these as different resources for like feeding the bacteria, allowing the community to grow, allowing the community to colonize and be very happy. And then over time, this improves the environment rather than just like fixing the gut, quote unquote. We're improving the environment with the combination of these sorts of things.
Right, yeah. That's really interesting. And I think what you said about fiber was interesting too, because obviously people who they might have gut inflammation, they'll go on a low FODMAP diet, and it might work in the meantime because you're not feeding the bad bacteria. But then once you get off of it, you realize that you actually need the good bacteria like Bifidobacterium, Akkermansia. So if you're is it at, like if you're not getting enough fiber after that stage, you're not going to be making that like good bacteria.
Yeah, so I have a little hack for that. Like in terms of the
Mhm.
fiber, what I'll do is if somebody has like all these FODMAP sensitivities, I'll give them something called partially hydrolyzed guar gum. It's hydrolyzed, right? So it has slower viscosity and it's less likely to irritate the intestinal tract. So I'll give them partially hydrolyzed guar gum, and this is a prebiotic fiber that's been known to help increase bifidobacteria status. So I'll give them that in the meantime while we're building them back up to be able to tolerate these certain forms of fiber. And then we're able to obviously do that. It changes their life. We get them to the next level. And that's why when we heal, right, it's in levels. Maybe we don't get to obviously add these foods back in until we're at level 15. And that's why I have to work people up to that point and really be clear about setting expectations before I actually even start working with them. Because if they're like, yep, I'm going to do this protocol and everything's going to be good in 3 months, I'm sorry to tell you, but that's probably not the case. Maybe if you're already like really good at this and you have a strong foundation, maybe, but typically it takes longer than that, and we have to move through things in a very strong stepwise approach.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's really important to be patient and understand that
Yeah.
if you're someone who's neglected health for like a long time, it's obviously going to take a lot longer for you to actually heal and, overcome what you've been dealing with. But when it comes to like the gut, you've obviously talked about like low stomach acid and a weak mucus layer. Are these like just as important as like these like huge um like issues that you see in a lot of patients?
Oh yeah, it's a huge deal, right? Because if you have low stomach acid, how are you going to get all the nutrients to facilitate healing? Like, how are you going to eat a pound of meat or something to get your protein intake in? Like, low stomach acid is a huge deal. If you have a bad mucus layer, that's a huge deal too, right? Your mucus layer makes secretory IgA to neutralize certain pathogens. And it's like the first layer of defense of our innate immune system in a way. So, if that's bad, you're already setting yourself up for a dysfunctional gut down the road, in my opinion, if you're predisposed to it, of course. Like you'll see some people and they'll have like all of these things going on when you look at their labs, and in terms of their health, they're like completely fine. They're like very resilient against it. But then you get other people who their life becomes a living hell the second one system goes wrong. So it's not only looking at like what's in front of you, but looking at the bio individuality of that unique person as well. So yeah, the mucus layer, the actual stomach acid, like all of those parts are super important. And that's why we have to be holistic and look at everything instead of just saying, yup, we're going to work on your adrenals for the first 9 months and then hopefully you're good. No, we got to look at everything and we got to see how it's all interacting together. And this gives us the clear-cut picture.
Right, yeah. So when it comes to stomach acid, because obviously that's like it's been described as like the first domino to fall, and everything else comes downstream of it. So how do we actually go about increasing someone's stomach acid, and like how do we decide like why is it low in the first place? How do we fix it? Like what interventions would we use?
Yeah, there could be a lot of reasons why it's low in the first place, but honestly, if you're going through and you're helping someone with that area of their physiology, yeah, it's going to be important to look at that, but we don't necessarily need to know the exact set of reasons why it dropped in the first place. it can be helpful, but just looking at the things that bring like basically the origins of health to that system, right? We'll look at things like how is your zinc status doing? Did you just go on like a little kick where you had no zinc in your diet and your stomach acid production declined? And then you have something maybe like Hashimoto's as well, or you have all these nutrient deficiencies that are associated with low stomach acid. And then we could kind of see that and think like, oh, are they in this terrible feedback loop where they're trying to get the nutrients in now and they don't have the stomach acid to actually digest them and fix this issue? So that's a very important thing. But you also want to you want to assess for things like H. pylori and whatnot, because that can mess with things like the stomach acid as well. And then if you do that proper assessment in terms of fixing the stomach acid, we got to figure out what is happening in the rest of the areas of the physiology, do what we do and normally address those areas. And then I personally like to use things like zinc carnosine, that's good at indirectly supporting it. Apple cider vinegar, it has acetic acid in it, so it's a precursor to stomach acid. We use that, and then we get the nutrient digestion back on par over time. We work on things like mitochondrial function and methylation to optimize those areas. And then over time, as we get the system more healthy and robust, the stomach acid will typically come back online and they're able to fix that up. But if somebody's very severe and they have like no stomach acid production at all, and it really sucks the big one basically. What we want to do is I can go in there and add something like betaine HCl to help them obviously increase that area, help with stomach acid production. And then we just work on that over time. And then that area is able to sort itself out and become optimized basically.
Right. So it's looking at like addressing all these fundamentals when it
Yeah.
comes to
Yeah.
stomach
I
acid.
have yeah, my next Substack article's on stomach acid, so prepare
Awesome.
yourself.
I'll look into
Yeah.
it. But yeah, so like you said, if you've not got adequate stomach acid, you're not going to be digesting nutrients, and this could lead to like nutrient deficiencies in a lot of clients.
Yes, sir. Yes, and you'll see like in the labs, right? Maybe you see low ALP, alkaline phosphatase, and there's an association with low ALP and a zinc deficiency, magnesium deficiency, vitamin C deficiency. And then maybe on top of that, you see low blood urea nitrogen, which can be representative of low protein intake. And you see that as well. And then you have them do like a week of chronometer where they're tracking their nutrition. And you're like, what's happening, dude? This person's eating a perfect diet. Like, how is it physically possible that they look like so nutrient deficient? And then you look into it and you see, like, oh, they have a hard time digesting meat. Oh, they belch all the time after they eat and they get bloated and there's no gas. And you see all of these, and they just feel like there's food sitting in their stomach. And then you look at the labs and that sort of stuff, and kind of an alarm goes off in your head, and you're like, have you ever tried the betaine HCl? Have you ever tried the apple cider vinegar? And then you get them on that sort of stuff, and they're like, Chris, my life has changed for the foreseeable future. So that's how it goes with my stomach acid clients a
Yeah,
lot. But yeah, those are some of the ways you can identify it. And the cool thing with labs is there's so many different areas that you can kind of identify to see, check in on that type of stuff.
right, yeah. And right, so it was methylation that I wanted to talk about. So you brought up methylation. Obviously, it's like people think it's like a buzzword, but it's like the way that the B vitamins sort of this is where like the B vitamins are really important. It's like I'd love for you to talk about methylation and what it actually does in the body.
Yeah, so methylation, very important. Very important. Like we even have things like histone acetylation on top of that, but methylation is important for obviously putting a methyl group on certain areas of our physiology and then saying like, hey, does this thing turn on or off? I don't want to overcomplicate it because methylation can get very deep into the weeds. But basically, there's all of these different reactions in our methyl cycles, and they're very important for the overall methylation process. And we have methyl donors like SAMe, and then even things like creatine are involved in this process. And we need all of these nutrients to ensure that things like histamine degradation or whatever are good, and that many of these reactions are obviously working properly. So when we look at things like the B vitamins, right? B9, B12, B6, B2, riboflavin, even things like vitamin A, all of these different things are very important and involved and ensuring that these methylation cycles are working properly. And if they're not, very common things that you'll see are things like these very funky histamine symptoms that you get, or maybe every single food that you eat, you just somehow have a horrible reaction to. Or maybe you supplement glycine or creatine and you have this horrible reaction. And what that can mean is maybe you're over methylating or under methylating something. And we'll use MTHFR as an example, the mother effer gene, we call it. But basically, it's this little like genetic variation that I think roughly 40% of the population has at this point. And it's where you're just obviously not the best. And you might have like an issue with not getting enough riboflavin in, and it might cause issues with homocysteine. But nevertheless, it's kind of like you're taking crude oil and putting it, I think Gary Brecka said this. It's good analogy, but it's like you're taking crude oil and you're putting it into your car instead of gasoline. You're not converting folate to its natural bioavailable form in the body that needs to be methylated to turn into gasoline rather than crude oil. So what can happen is if you're eating this sort of stuff and you're supplementing folic acid, right? It can just accumulate in the body and cause very bad issues. And then maybe you end up with things like funky homocysteine levels, which is associated with cardiovascular disease. Maybe you end up with some other funky markers. But when we're looking at immune health, mitochondrial health, all of these other areas, I find that methylation is a very important area and just some things that you can do to support this without overcomplicating things, since this is a very complex area of physiology, would be get vitamin B1, B2, B5, B6, B9, even B7. B12, molybdenum, morning sunlight, glycine, creatine. All these things are going to be important. And even some people, they'll need things like trimethylglycines obviously help out with that. They're not very effective at methylating glycine in that capacity. So there's all those different areas that you want to look into. And what I like to say is that with a lot of my clients, I can't start working on methylation stuff with them until we get to like level 20. Like we got to really work them up and get them through a gut protocol, get them through these other areas, get their physiology nice, strong, and robust. And then once we work on the methylation, this can ultimately be what makes a lot of things run more smoothly in the body.
Right, that's really interesting. What I've heard is that if you supplement creatine, then because creatine's made from methylation, then that spares methyl groups so that you're able to make a lot of other thing important
Yes, sir.
molecules so that and that's why it can be a great idea to supplement creatine.
Yes, sir. But some people, right? They'll react if they have a methylation issue. It's kind of like, how do I put it? It's like if you start a factory assembly machine and it's going too fast and you make too much product, and then you don't have enough workers to like handle it all. If somebody's sensitive and they have like these methylation issues, they might respond very poorly to creatine, and we need to do other peripheral work on their physiology until they get to a point where they can actually tolerate that and then taper themselves up to get on the appropriate dosage. For me personally, I would always just get this severe brain fog when I would take creatine for the longest time. And then I worked on things like my gut, the immune system, obviously getting other methyl donors in. And then I was good enough to actually take the creatine at a higher dose. So it's something that you got to play around with a lot. And in my opinion, there's no perfect science to methylation yet. Like there's a lot that's being talked about. I think that Chris Masterjohn is one of the better experts that you could look into for that sort of thing. But nevertheless, there's no perfect science. And a lot of the time there is like more of an art than a science approach where it's very bio-individual when you're looking at all of this sort of stuff.
Right, yeah, 100%. Because I think a lot of people, when they take supplements, they react differently,
Yeah.
and I think for them, like, they might see it as, well, this supplement, like, is just blanketly not a good thing for me to take. But there's obviously a lot of nuance when it comes to why they might be reacting to it in the first place. But yeah, I'd love to talk a bit about, like, infections and, parasitic infections, fungal infections, even, like autoimmunity. So, what are some factors in blood work that, or even symptoms which indicate that someone's got some sort of infection or inflammation?
hmm Yeah, so the biggest thing with chronic infection or chronic inflammation, look at your neutrophils. Are they between 3,000 cells per UL and 4,500 cells per UL, or are they sitting at 1,800 cells per UL? That's a really big thing with the neutrophils and the white blood cell count because the body undergo during an infection, right? The body undergoes this process called chemotaxis, where it's going to take the neutrophils from the bloodstream and it's going to say, "Hey, yo, neutrophils, get over there. Go take care of that infection for me, please." And it's going to send the cells to that area. And then if you're getting labs done, right, and you're getting that stuff measured and they're measuring it from your bloodstream, we would expect in the instance of a chronic infection that perhaps it does mean that your neutrophils are lower because they're fighting a chronic infection elsewhere in the body on a chronic basis. So basically, we're going to look at the labs and we're going to see like, is it an acute or chronic infection? If it's acute, you're going to most likely see higher neutrophils. If it's more chronic, you're going to see them a bit lower. And basically, neutrophils that are low, they can mean many other things too, like autoimmunity, parasites, intestinal permeability, can mean copper deficiency. So you want to do your proper process of deduction there as well. But if you have a fungal infection, right, and you have candida producing acetaldehyde, maybe you notice that your AST and ALT are raised in addition to the neutrophil thing that we talked about. Or maybe in addition to that, if you have a viral infection, you'll notice that you have very high lymphocytes. Or maybe if you have a parasitic infection, you'll notice all these weird symptoms around like insomnia, mental health, whatever. They feel like they're going crazy. They have very weird and funky electrolyte markers. Their glucose markers are messed up, their neutrophils are all messed up and their monocytes are high. You'll see like, and maybe if it's worms, because obviously we have protozoan parasites and the more hemolytic ones, which are worms. If it's worms, you might see that you have very elevated eosinophils. So there's a lot that goes into the analysis of that. But when you're looking at the actual blood chemistries, those are some of the very important markers to actually consider in all of that. And another one that's underrated is your iron markers, actually, because obviously, or not viruses, but fungus, bacteria, that sort of stuff. Parasites, they love iron. Like they want to find that iron and they just want to eat it all. Like they love it. It's their favorite thing in the world. It's like how I react when I see like a 20-ounce ribeye in front of me. So basically, we want to look at the iron markers and we want to see like why is this dude's ferritin super low, but their serum iron is through the roof? Like this doesn't make sense. Well, perhaps it's because it's causing an inflammatory response to liberate ferritin from its stores, the iron in the ferritin, so that those microbes can actually take it. And when I see this sort of stuff and I see their irons getting all wonky and I see they're trending towards anemia and I see that they have an infection, I'm like, you know what? It's time to bust out the lactoferrin because lactoferrin is an iron binding glycoprotein and it's to take the iron from whatever is trying to mess around with the person's body and it's to give it back to the host and say no more. In addition to that, it has antimicrobial effects as well, making it a very nice Swiss Army knife for that sort of stuff. But nevertheless, we can even use things like our iron markers to get insight into whether somebody has a chronic infection. Or we can even see a B12, right? And we see that it's super high. We can actually look at that B12, and if it's like through the roof, one of the possible reasons why that could be would actually be a high neutrophil activity. So we can look at all those different areas of our physiology, and we can obviously look for certain clues and then see, hey, are you bloating? Do you have a bunch of food sensitivities? Do you have a bunch of issues like with fungus, for example? Do you have like excessive gas or excessively bad smelling gas or sugar cravings or these urges to binge eat or that type of stuff? And we can look at all these different areas and look at these kind of like key signs depending on what the microbe could be. Even in there's like somewhat of an association. It's not necessarily clear, but you could see that GGT is a little bit lower in those who have a gram-negative bacteria overgrowth. And then you can look at HDL cholesterol, and if it's super high, that can actually signify that you might have LPS or a bit of dysbiosis going on. So there's all these different markers that we have to look at, and none of it's going to make sense unless you do the process of deduction and look through the labs and look through the assessments and actually give all of this data the actual care that it needs to be properly analyzed.
Right, yeah. And what you mentioned about like iron and anemia, that makes a lot of sense to me because it seems to me that there's like two reasons or two types of anemia. Sometimes it literally just is an iron deficiency and you're not getting enough iron from food. Whereas sometimes it's like the body's keeping iron locked up so that it doesn't feed pathogens. So that would mean what like ferritin would be quite high and transferrin, so like serum iron would be quite low. So is that like the body trying to
Yeah.
protect the iron from being eaten by pathogens?
Yeah, so the ferritin's a big one. If it's really high, and this can happen from inflammation even, you can get anemia of chronic disease where it's going to be like, hey, iron, stay where you are. And then it's going to drop the TIBC, so your total iron binding capacity. And your body's like, hey, we got to chill out with this sort of stuff. So basically, yeah, that can definitely be a factor. And you'll see that like ferritin is all jacked up and whatnot, and that the body's like very intentionally trying to conserve that stuff. And then the question becomes like, why does this person have iron overload? Is it hemochromatosis, which I have? Is it from an infection, that sort of thing? And if it is an infection and it is anemia of chronic disease, what happens is the body will mess with its natural hepcidin production and it'll alter that. And then you'll basically just see that iron is being conserved as a result.
Right, yeah. And I think when you start to understand it from a perspective of like the body's always trying to protect you. So if ferritin is really high, then that's the body protecting you from pathogens feeding on iron. So I think
It could be.
what
It could
once
be,
you,
but what if
yeah,
you have, what if you have hemochromatosis instead? That could
right,
just be a genetic defect that's not actually being resolved actively. So for some people, it can be both too. So it's always something you want to assess for, and that's why we do the process of deduction, because then we can safely say like, okay, it's most likely from this reason. But somebody could have like ferritin of 700, and they could have no infection whatsoever. And let's say that somebody read their panel wrong, right? And they didn't say like, hey, let's check and assess for hemochromatosis. They could give them a full-on antimicrobial phase, kill some of their good bacteria, and put them in a worse place than they were already like there in the beginning. Like they could bring their health back in a way. And that's why we have a very strong responsibility to assess this stuff with the care that needs to be obviously cared to in this context. So we're looking at all of that info, we're assessing it properly, and we're saying like, could it be hemochromatosis? Either way, we have to figure this out.
right, yeah. And how connected do you think all of like this infection, all of these infections, and whether they're parasitic or fungal to gut health and gut dysbiosis, like SIBO? I know you talked about how fungal overgrowth can affect the gut negatively, but in terms of these other types of like infections, do they all sort of spill over to the gut?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, obviously if it's like a gut infection and it's localized there, it's going to be a bit of it like bacterial, right? They have an endotoxin on their outer cell wall called LPS, and it can cause issues to the actual gut and obviously stimulate the TL or the TLR4 pathway. And then that can obviously cause different issues. It can circulate, it can cause pancreatic inflammation, it can cause inflammation all throughout the body in a way. And then parasites have their own unique mechanisms of action too through things like molecular mimicry, similar to how Candida likes to do it. So basically, they all have like their own unique mechanisms of action, and they can all cause like their own different issues in the guts in their own unique way. But this is why you got to be really good about your lab reading and obviously looking through symptomology, because they basically require different antimicrobials that can be effective for them, right? Like neem might like allicin, for example, might be better for like an M. smithii overgrowth compared to something like neem. Or maybe something like berberine will be more effective for candida and parasites in comparison to something like allicin. So by determining which type of microbe it could most likely be and going through that with an evidence-based holistic approach, you're giving yourself a much better likelihood of utilizing the correct intervention and not having to play guesswork all day.
Right, yeah, that's really interesting. With because obviously a lot of people suffer from gut issues, and it just seems like most of the time gut issues and infections, they just go hand in hand.
Yeah, they really do, don't they? But
Yeah,
there could be some instances where somebody just has like no good bacteria. And obviously, like that does open the door for candida to come in there. But there could be instances where they just have like terrible stomach acid and can't digest anything. There could be instances where their like microbiome is pretty good and they just get acid reflux from a bunch of these issues. So it's always like it's never like a definitive thing, and that's why every case needs to be restarted as like a fresh slate, basically.
yeah, I
To
think,
look at the
yeah,
data you have in front of you and say, here's what this is, here's what the evidence is telling me. Even though I've obviously had these experiences or cases in the past, just scratch that away and say, like, here's what's in front of me. Here's what this person is likely experiencing. And then that will give you a very good indication of what are the specific issues in that person's body.
right. And with infections and whether they're parasitic, fungal, we also see that they affect the thyroid, whether it's thyroid antibodies or yeah, Hashimoto's. So what's the connection between, infections and thyroid and how, like what are the consequences on the body and how do we begin to overcome these
Yeah,
issues?
well, for those, the biggest sort of infection that can impact the thyroid, like hands down, would actually be viral infections for those of us that actually believe in viruses. But basically, yeah, viruses are real, by the way,
Yeah.
guys. Like most likely, a lot of good evidence on that. Just because you don't trust the laboratory technology doesn't make it incorrect. So just had to get that out of the way.
Mhm.
But viruses, right? Epstein-Barr virus, there is a very clear association in the literature with EBV, like active EBV, hurting the actual thyroid function. And what this can do, right, is it can actually impact the conversion of like free T4 to free T3, so inactive to active thyroid hormone. And it can just basically have issues with the thyroid overall. So if it's a viral issue, right, you want to ask, like, why is my immune system not taking care of this chronic viral load? So by doing that, right, it's kind of like a water bottle. We want to see like what is making the viral load go up here? Like, and how do we drop it down to here so that it's actually tame and managed? So with a lot of my clients, right, that always starts with the basics and looking at what are the other areas that are weakened. Do you have a co-occurring fungal infection that's obviously putting strain on the immune system? Do you have any of these other issues going on, like leaky gut, that could be putting more strain? Are you eating a ton of gluten alongside it, and then the gluten is doing molecular mimicry at the thyroid, and it's raising your thyroid antibodies? So we want to look at all those areas, and then we want to consider like, should we do an antiviral protocol or not? And that's done by another investigation. And we're going to look through that evidence, we're going to look through that data, and then we're going to see simultaneously, as we're getting rid of the viruses and obviously fighting against them, what can we do to rebuild this person's system to where in the future, where they don't have to take a bunch of supplements, how can their body remain resilient against these viruses, given that they have them? And then over time, it's obviously a matter of refining those areas. And then once we get them, their immune system and their physiology strong, robust, and just ready to rock and roll, then they can be in a much better position where they might not experience the same thyroid effects from obviously having those said viruses.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think the thyroid is obviously a big topic. People talk about like Hashimoto's, primary hypothyroidism,
Yeah,
secondary
big deal.
hypothyroidism, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, some of the biggest things I've seen with the thyroid, just in my practice, is it's always three things. Like I swear, like it's not always three things. That'd be very wrong of me to say, but three very common things that I see are nutrient deficiencies, which they can be from low stomach acid or SIBO, right? That can cause that. The next one would be just chronically terrible redox homeostasis. So they're inside all day, they're under blue light, they're not like connected to nature in any way, shape, or form. And then in addition to that, good old chronic inflammation. So those three things are very effective at making your T4 to T3 ratio very poor. And obviously, sometimes it's the literal thyroid gland itself that's dysfunctional. And then other times you can simply just have an issue with the conversion of T4 to T3. So when you look at thyroid markers, that's why it's important to look at things like the thyroid antibodies, reverse T3, T3 to T4 ratio. You want to look at the whole picture so you can see like exactly what is going on here in terms of the thyroid. And then once you have that information, you can start to think of, okay, maybe they do have the wacky T4 to T3 ratio and everything else looks good. Let's assess for nutrient deficiencies. Let's assess for poor redox homeostasis. Let's assess for chronic inflammation. And then that gives us a lot of insight, doesn't it?
yeah. And when it comes to the nutrient deficiencies, obviously we know it's iodine, but it's also is it selenium that's also
Selenium.
critical?
Yeah, that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are yeah.
Selenium. And just you want like the other nutrients, right? Like potassium, calcium. You want all of those to be rocking and rolling because in one way or another, there's going to be some sort of indirect pathway that requires many of these nutrients that we get as a cofactor. So I always tell people like don't get too deep in the weeds. Literally go on the chronometer, look at all of the nutrients, look at all of the RDAs. They can make the magnesium RDA a little higher, but Nevertheless, you want to make sure you're hitting your micronutrients on a daily basis. Like your nutrition can be medicinal if you get it right. So, huge deal with that. But yes, selenium and iodine are two of the very big ones. I don't recommend that people supplement iodine. I've actually had like basically clients in the past who have reported that they've experienced like full-on mania from taking the iodine at too high of doses. And there's a dude on Twitter who's actually made himself manic a few times from taking the iodine and recommending it to everyone he knows. So we got to be very careful with supplementing iodine, guys. That's the one extra thing I'll say on that. But yeah, it's always in your best interest, right? To look at all of the nutrients and see what can we do with each and every one of these. Even vitamin E, we can get creative at that one, and we can say, hey, did you know that red palm oil is very high in vitamin E? Then you add that to your diet a few times a week. Boom.
Yeah. I think with vitamins and like supplements, there's obviously a lot of dogma where people think like, all supplements are good. And then some people think, well, all supplements are bad, but it's like there's a lot of context and nuance, and it really just
Yes.
depends on the person's individual situation. Like um you could argue that with for a lot of people, like they have to use modern solutions to help them overcome issues that are caused by modern problems. Like they might not be able to control it. They might have shift work. They might have chronic circadian disruption. They might, you know, just
Precisely. Yeah.
it's like you have to look at each person's individual context and you can't just and sometimes that does require using supplements strategically.
100%. Yeah. And one thing to consider is in your food, right? Because God is the best. That's what I always say. In your food, those nutrients come in at very specific ratios with one another. Whereas if you're taking an iron supplement, a copper supplement, any of that, there's no guarantee that you're getting a proper ratio of something like iron and compared to zinc or copper. And that can actually hurt the overall metabolism of those nutrients into your body. So you want to be very careful with supplementing certain nutrients, especially things like iron and copper and a lot of the minerals. And I'm just a bigger fan of if you're able to get it from food, please do it. But if you're not, then you can obviously take a very evidence-based approach, be responsible about what you're supplementing it with in what ratio and that sort of stuff. So that's the approach I typically take with my clients. Like I'll give a lot of people a B complex and well, obviously we'll give them that and it's water soluble, so you'll just urinate a lot of that stuff out. But basically, yeah, you want to look at the ratios and all of those things. And I find that if you can just get somebody to eat very well, that's like king. That's one of the best things you can do.
Yeah, I think yeah, 100%. And I think when we talk about supplements, like we said, we've got to be using them strategically. And when you look at like blood work as a whole, you do just sort of understand that like we said, everything's connected, or like gut health, thyroid, immune system, iron, like every like nutrient deficiency, stomach acid, like it's actually very refreshing to realize that everything's connected because it allows you to like connect the dots a lot better, whereas the conventional system just looks at like isolated blood markers and isolated areas of physiology. And it's obviously a lot more difficult to actually, you know, heal if you're only addressing one pillar and you're not considering how these different factors interplay with each other.
Yeah, yeah. It's very well said. I love it. Yeah,
Yeah.
very nice.
So, sort of as a last topic, what are your thoughts on like other sorts of tests, apart from blood work? So we've got, HTMA mineral testing, stool tests, GI maps, and I think there's one like the Dutch test. I'm not sure what that stands for, but what are your thoughts on all these other ones and when
Yeah.
would they be
Yeah.
necessary?
Yep. So GI map, it's obviously with a GI map, you're mostly looking at what is happening in the large bowel. It's not giving you the context, it's what's happening in the small bowel. So we just have to remember that nuance of looking at it because somebody could literally have like severe SIBO and then like not much could show up on the GI map potentially. So keep that in mind. But I love GI maps personally. It can give me an indication of whether somebody has low bacteria, high bacteria, parasites, fungus. It could tell me about their secretory IgA. It can tell me about beta glucuronidase, which is involved in estrogen metabolism. And it's nothing I give to my clients right away. I just start with blood chemistry because I don't want to break the bank. But for those that like to do the investment, I think that they're pretty awesome. I like the doctor's data GI map. Oat tests are pretty cool. You can obviously look at the organic acid metabolites and you can see how that works in the context of like internal mitochondrial metabolism, that sort of stuff. And I can see like, oh, your ketones are all super elevated and some of these things look weird. Maybe you have issues with internal glucose metabolism. So it can give me a lot of insights, even with like dopaminergic metabolites for that person. If they have high arabinose, it could give me insights into things like fungal overgrowths. So love those. Those are another good thing. Chris Masterjohn actually came out with a mitochondrial test recently. It's called Mitome. Big
I saw
fan of
that.
that
Yeah,
one.
I saw that. Like,
Yeah,
I think that's
it's
really,
good.
really cool.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. Big fan of that one. So like that one a lot too. And then let's see, Dutch tests, those can be pretty good. I don't use them as much, but because I can obviously look at like the hormones and go to a blood work without making somebody pay $500. But and hormones I find are a very downstream issue. Like a lot of the time when I fix like a lot of these upstream things, the hormones come with it. But if we get to a case where it's just so confusing with the hormones and we have to look at things like the adrenals too, I find that the Dutch test can be useful for studying like the specific estrogen metabolites and what's happening in their system. And then maybe you pair that with like their beta glucuronidase and it gives you a lot of info on estrogen. But they can be pretty good. I think the Dutch test is like honestly just a really, really, really good form of hormonal testing. And then HTMA is a very hot topic. A lot of the like proper evidence from HTMAs have come from anecdotal toxicology textbooks. That doesn't mean that they're bad or that they're incorrect. What that does mean is that you want to look at it and really think upon it critically and be intellectually humble. Because I know certain practitioners like Metalsbrock Clark, who's absolutely incredible. I've heard nothing but good things about the work that he does. He's obviously a God-fearing man, and I have a lot of respect for him. And he does it very well, from my understanding. And he's able to obviously do this all very gracefully and do this in a separate manner where it could be very effective. But I find that in like the naturopathic spaces, there is like a lot of poor interpretation of the HTMA test, and most of the labs are actually very terrible for HTMAs. Like you could go and get four HTMA tests in a row, 4 days in a row, and you could get totally different results on all of them. And there's literally documented literature explaining this. So you want to be careful with it. And if you want to do an HTMA, I can only speak for the people who I know are very good at it. So go see Clark, basically, Metalsbra, if you want to see an HTMA. And if you're looking for mentorship from him, from what I've seen, I think he's a very reliable source. So I'm not out on HTMAs, but you would need very proper training to interpret them. And there's just heaps of information that you need to understand about the human body before you can use that as like your first line of defense in terms of getting all of that stuff tested. So for me personally, my two favorite to look into most commonly would be like good old blood chemistry, maybe a gene test, and then GI maps. Like those are my favorites to look at right off the bat. But I think depending on like the reason you want to do it, they're all pretty valid, like the ones that I mentioned. And honestly, it really because like blood work, right? If you go to the doctor, you're gonna get a very crappy interpretation most of the time. But you go to the right person in their field who's obviously very educated on how to read it, and you're gonna get really good information out of that that can move your health journey in the right direction. So it's all about like it's not only about like the test that you get done, but the person reading it as well.
Right, yeah. And I think, yeah, it's just really, really important to make sure that like it's being interpreted correctly and all of these different factors are being considered. So are there any tests that could test for like genetic things such as like MTHFR or
Yeah, gene
hyper like
test.
right, yeah. So would that include stuff like familial hypercholesterolemia, it, like just
Yeah.
all these genetic factors which could
Yeah,
affect.
I actually uploaded my data, my genetic data, to a website called Self Decode, and I was able to find all my SNPs. And my physician had actually told me that there wasn't enough evidence for them to test me for hemochromatosis, even though my ferritin was at 670. So yeah, my ferritin was 670% saturation, 55%, iron through the roof. Like everything, TIBC was at like 240. So I was like, this looks like clear evidence that I have this. And the physician was like, nope, we're not going to order the gene test. So I took things into my own hands and I found out that I had it. And I was like, thank you, medical system. So basically found that out just through my own gene tests. And if you obviously get one of those gene tests done, I think they can be a very helpful thing.
Right,
Like
yeah.
you could literally have like a vitamin D receptor mutation and you wouldn't even know it unless you had the gene test.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really, really critical that people understands like obviously genetics don't determine everything, but if you have some issues that like the blood work and the symptoms and everything's not like it's not making sense and it might just be genetic.
Yeah, or you get like the classic case where somebody like can't let go of emotions, they have ADHD, they like are literally just super hyper stimulated all the time. And then you get a gene test and I'm like, "Oh, by the way, did you know that you have COMT?" And then their whole life changes because they realize like, "Okay, this is what my genetics are. My DNA isn't my destiny. Here are the interventions that I need to intelligently use to get past what I'm given." And that's what life is, right? You're playing with the cards that you're given. When things suck, no, you can't always change your external circumstances. You could change how you internally respond to them, though. You think about through that stuff, you think, what can I do about this situation with the cards that I'm given? And you go in there and optimize. So, me, right? Somebody who has hemochromatosis, I go and donate my blood every 56 days because I don't want to give up red meat and I feel pretty good. And I also take IP6, which is able to obviously limit iron absorption with my meals. And I found a very successful way to obviously live with this condition that I have, despite the fact that it ruined my life for so many years. And I found a way to do this sustainably. And if you do have hemochromatosis, that's also a big deal because it gives any sort of microbe that you might not want an unlimited food supply. So keep that in mind.
Interesting. Interesting. I think, yeah, this was a really good conversation. We really went
Yeah,
in depth about like
yeah, you're the man, dude.
how all the different issues in the body are connected. So yeah, where can people find you, Chris, to work with you?
Yeah. So my website is mitobio.co. So
Yeah.
mitobio.co. My Twitter or my X, as they call it now, is Mitopapi. So Mitopapi. Same thing for my Substack. It's Mitopapi. And then my Instagram is just the Mito Poppy because Mito Poppy was taken on there apparently. So it's TheMitoPapi. So that's where you can find me on my website. I also do have a school community for those that obviously don't want to do a full program. And if you just want to learn, I believe it's 37 USD a month right now. And then you can join the school community, and we have a lot of good info in there. So that'll be on my website as well. And then, yeah,
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Chris.
thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course, of course. Excited to chat next time.
Yeah, man. Just, yeah, thank you so much for having me on and God bless you.
If you enjoyed that episode of the Ancestral Cure podcast, please give it a like, give it a comment, and share it to your friends. Your support means so much to me here, and thank you all for listening.